They say the devil doesn't make you do it. He just points out how easy it is to step over the edge. And that's exactly what happened in the early hours of August 15, 1967. It was the day Canada witnessed one of its most chilling, most tragic, random mass murders, leaving 9 innocent souls lost forever. Victor Hoffman, a troubled young man fresh out of a mental hospital, was desperate to avoid going back. Back in the 1960s, mental health care was far from what it is today. It was underfunded, misunderstood, and often stigmatized. So Victor made himself a promise. He wouldn't return to that place. And oh boy, he kept that promise. But in a way so chilling it lingers in your mind long after you hear the story. But before we dive into the dark heart of it all, let's take a step back and understand Victor's childhood and what led him to that mental facility in the first place. Born in 1946, Victor grew up in what seemed like a typical hard-working family. His parents, Robert and Stella Hoffman, were devout Lutherans living in the small village of Liask, Canada. The Hoffmans were known for their dedication to farming, their faith, and keeping Sundays sacred. They were the kind of family people would describe as ordinary and God-fearing. Victor was the 5th of 7 children in the Hoffman household. As a boy, he didn't stand out much from his siblings. His parents described him as a diligent, responsible child who hit all the usual milestones. By all accounts, he was a solid worker on the family farm and had a natural knack for hunting. He loved guns and spent a lot of time honing his skills as a hunter. However, there was one thing about Victor that set him apart. He was a loner. He didn't have friends and struggled in school, largely because he couldn't concentrate. Still, his parents didn't think much of it at the time. To them, Victor was just a quiet, independent kid. However, Victor later told psychiatrists that his struggles began when he was just 6 years old. That was the first time he saw the devil. He described the figure vividly, a towering black creature, 6 feet tall, with a long tail. From that moment, he felt torn between 2 forces, God and Satan, each trying to claim him. The battle within Victor's mind was relentless. He often woke up in the middle of the night to strange tapping sounds that would grow louder and faster. By the time he turned 10, these experiences had grown darker. Victor began having violent impulses, urges to kill that consumed his thoughts daily. He fantasized about harming his family and even strangers he had just met. But Victor kept his disturbing thoughts to himself, hiding them from his parents and siblings. To cope, he directed his violent tendencies toward animals. Killing animals gave him a sense of relief, even happiness, which he likened to the satisfaction a hunter feels after a successful kill. The devil, however, never left Victor alone. One morning while eating breakfast, he heard a voice calling out to him. Following the voice outside, he claimed to have encountered Satan again, this time in an even more grotesque form, a 6'6" man, weighing over 300 pounds, with the face of a pig. The devil promised Victor wealth and power in exchange for his soul. Though Victor claimed he didn't want to make a deal, he admitted to kneeling on one knee, hoping to at least become half as rich. But nothing came of it. Now, these encounters with the devil only deepened his already fragile mental state. He also claimed to see cold, dismembered hands floating in his room, and worse, he could feel them touch him. The devil's visits became a regular occurrence, with the dark figure relentlessly approaching Victor, asking for his soul. But no matter how many times the devil came, Victor refused to give in. Not long after these visits started, Victor allegedly began seeing angels. Unlike the devil, these angels appeared less frequently. According to Victor, they looked like human women, dressed elegantly, and their main goal was to guide him away from the devil's grasp. Victor believed they were messengers of God, sent to protect him and keep him on the right path. One day, Victor claimed he received a divine message. The angels and God themselves had tasked him with an extraordinary mission. If he could capture and destroy the devil, They promised to take him to heaven. This message consumed Victor. It gave him a sense of purpose, though it only made his behavior more erratic. Determined to fulfill this divine task, Victor tried everything he could think of to trap the devil. He started with nets, but those plans didn't work. Frustrated, he came up with a new plan. He'd shoot the devil down. On May 27, 1966, Victor's mother Stella found him outside in their backyard, firing his rifle into the sky. By the time she got there, he had already fired 3 rounds. Confused and understandably scared, Stella demanded to know what he was doing. His answer was chilling yet simple. "I shot the devil." Stella begged him to stop and managed to coax him back inside the house. Victor reluctantly put the rifle down, but then grabbed the family car and drove off. While he was gone, Stella and the rest of the family scrambled to hide every gun in the house. When Victor returned, he asked for the guns back, promising no harm would come to anyone. But his family refused. Agitated, he left again, only to come back shortly after, this time asking to speak with their pastor. The pastor arrived, and the two had a private conversation. Stella couldn't hear much of what was said, but when they stepped outside to finish their talk, she heard Victor say something that shook her to her core. "I'd like to kill my mom." That was it. Stella and her husband, Robert, knew they couldn't wait any longer. The next day, they made arrangements to have Victor admitted to Saskatchewan Hospital. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Back in 1967, Saskatchewan Hospital was a big mental health facility located in North Battleford, Saskatchewan, Canada. At that time, mental health care wasn't as advanced as it is now. Hospitals like Saskatchewan were more like institutions where patients were often locked away and given basic care. The focus wasn't really on helping people get better or recover. Patients were more or less kept in check. Treatments were mainly about managing symptoms with medication, and there wasn't much emphasis on understanding or treating the root causes of their conditions. Now, when Victor underwent his initial psychiatric evaluation, the attending doctor officially diagnosed him with schizophrenia. The severity of his condition left no room for debate. Victor needed to be hospitalized. Surprisingly, he didn't resist. He voluntarily agreed to commit himself, perhaps believing it was the best option for everyone, including himself. According to the records, he wasn't just battling a serious mental illness. His body was also showing signs of stress. He'd often be found talking to himself, laughing at nothing, and deep in confusion about his own identity. At one point, he even questioned whether he was a boy or a girl, adding to the chaos in his mind. He was cooperative with the doctors during his exams, but came across as withdrawn, vague, and indifferent. It seemed like Victor felt like an outsider in his own family, as they just couldn't understand what he was going through. He mentioned to his siblings that he saw the devil, but they just mocked him, laughing off his concerns. Victor wasn't just imagining things, though. He believed the devil was punishing him because he refused to sell his soul. At one point, he even thought that someone else's brain was inside his body. He claimed the brain belonged to a girl named Denise, and she wanted to take full control of him. His doctors explained all of this as mere illusions, but Victor was convinced otherwise. He felt like he had touched both the devil and angels, so he wasn't ready to let go of his beliefs. But as time went on, Victor realized that if he kept insisting that he was seeing the devil, he'd never get out of the hospital. So, he tried to convince himself that it was all in his head. He wanted to get better, to live a life without fear, and to leave the constant anxiety behind. The doctors started him on a treatment plan that included electroconvulsive therapy, 12 sessions in total, tranquilizers, occupational therapy, and supportive psychotherapy. By the end of his treatment, doctors believed that Victor had come to terms with the idea that all the devil sightings were just figments of his imagination. Victor seemed to buy into this too, as he no longer feared the devil and his mind appeared clearer than ever before. He was happy and cooperative. though still somewhat withdrawn and inclined to be alone at times. But here's the catch. Even though Victor was no longer scared of the devil, his darker impulses didn't go away. He still had violent thoughts, imagining killing his family and people around him for no reason other than the simple desire to do so. He openly shared these impulses with his doctors, and they were aware of them. Despite this, they were optimistic about his recovery. They told his father that he would be fine in a year or two, with some more therapy. So, despite knowing about Victor's dangerous impulses, the doctors discharged him from the hospital on July 26, 1967. They sent him back home to his father, along with a prescription for tranquilizers, hoping that this would keep him calm and prevent any further dangerous behavior. But life at home didn't exactly go as planned. Victor had a tough time adjusting back to life on the farm. He was surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of home, but something felt wrong. His mind was still clouded, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the world wasn't the same as it had been before his hospitalization. The medication prescribed to him didn't help much either. In fact, it made things worse. The tranquilizers made him feel incredibly sleepy, which interfered with his work on the farm. On top of that, his back hurt constantly, adding to his growing frustration. By August 8th, Victor had had enough of the medication. He complained that the tranquilizers made him feel weak and useless, and he desperately wanted to get back to his normal routine. He needed to feel strong again, especially to be able to help on the farm. So he made a choice. He stopped taking the pills. At first, he didn't notice any drastic changes, but a few days later, something shifted within him. On August 11th, Victor woke up with an unsettling feeling. It wasn't like the usual emotions he felt on a bad day. This was different. He had a strong sense that something was about to happen, but he couldn't explain why. All he knew was that he felt like he would either end up back in the hospital or in jail. Victor's biggest fear was going back to the hospital. The idea of being locked away again terrified him, and he said he'd rather die than face that fate. In his mind, he had been suffering for so long, and the hospital was just a place where people didn't understand him. He believed that the worst part wasn't the treatments or the isolation, it was being trapped in a place where no one could see what was really going on inside his mind. Victor had always felt different, and he began to believe that he had a special ability. He called it visions. These weren't just regular dreams or daydreams, though. According to Victor, these visions were a way of seeing the future. He believed that these premonitions had been happening for as long as he could remember, and they would come to him every day. And with each vision, there was always the same unsettling feeling. After seeing the future, he would imagine killing someone. It was as if this act would somehow prove to the devil that he was finally on his side, that he wasn't afraid to do whatever it took. On August 14th, Victor's day started off pretty normally. He spent the day working on the tractor, trying to keep himself busy and occupied. But by 9:30 p.m., he was exhausted. He fell asleep on the sofa, but around 11:30 p.m., his parents woke him up and asked him to go to his bedroom. He went back to sleep but woke up again around 3 a.m., unable to rest any longer. It was then that he decided to go to the garage and try to distract himself with some work. But after working for a while, he still couldn't shake the feeling of restlessness. So he began pacing back and forth in the garage, letting his mind wander. That's when something strange happened. As Victor stood by the garage door, he suddenly felt a strange sensation in the side of his head. It wasn't painful, more like a sudden rush of pleasure. He described it as if his body had been sliced in half and something had left him. It wasn't a feeling of pain, but more like release. It was as if all the tension and fear he had been holding on to suddenly vanished. But in its place, the urge to kill grew even stronger. The feeling surged through him, taking over his mind. With this new, overwhelming urge to kill, Victor decided he needed to do something about it. He grabbed his .22 Browning pump-action repeater rifle and loaded it up. He wasn't thinking clearly, but all he knew was that he needed to act. His plan was simple. He would drive around for about an hour, look for small rodents to hunt, and then head back home to finish his chores. He was looking for squirrels, particularly those living in the spruce trees around his farm. But as he drove for what felt like an eternity, he found no squirrels, no small animals at all. Victor could have taken that as a sign to turn around, but something inside him kept him going. The thought of killing wouldn't leave him. He couldn't ignore the pull to find something, someone, to take his frustration out on. He kept driving, passing house after house. It wasn't until around 6 a.m., when the sky was starting to brighten, that he came across a simple farmhouse. It didn't look any different from the dozens of other houses he had passed along the way, but for some reason, the feeling inside him became stronger. It was as if this place was calling to him. Unfortunately, the farmhouse where Victor ended up was home to the Peterson family, who lived in Shell Lake, about 40 miles away from Victor's place in Lesk. Unlike Victor's troubled life, the Peterson household was filled with joy and laughter. They were a big, close-knit family with 10 members in total. At the heart of the family was James Peterson, a hard-working, humble man who was all about community. After serving in World War II, James bought 328 acres of land and became a mixed grain and cattle farmer. But life wasn't easy, and when his father retired, James took on an additional 72 acres, making his workload even heavier. Back then in Canada, it wasn't uncommon for families to be large, and the Petersons were no different. They had 9 kids, ranging from the oldest, Kathy, who was 19, down to the youngest, Larry, who was just 1. The rest of the children were Jean, 17, Mary, 13, Dorothy, 11, Pearl, 9, Phyllis, 4, William, 5, and Colin, 2. The Peterson kids were known as well-behaved, polite, and liked by everyone around them. The whole family had a reputation for being good, respectable folks. They were an ordinary, church-going family, and honestly, no one had anything bad to say about them. Kathy was the only one who wasn't living at home at the time. She had recently gotten married and moved to British Columbia with her husband. The rest of the Petersons lived together in a modest, cozy farmhouse with just 4 rooms. Out of those, only 2 were used as bedrooms. The kids all slept together in one room, except for the 1-year-old baby, who shared a bed with James and Evelyn. It was crowded, but they made it work. They weren't rich by any means, but the Petersons never complained. They cherished what they had, especially their family. James and Evelyn were totally focused on their kids and built a home around them. They loved their children above all else and wanted the best for them. Their oldest daughter, Jean, was an up-and-coming athlete, and her parents were determined to support her talent. So, to help pay for a track camp she wanted to attend in Dundurn, James decided to call up his neighbor, Wildrew Lang. He needed help hauling 50 bushels of hay to the grain elevator to sell the next morning, on August 15, 1967. The very same day that Victor, at that moment, was feeling the uncontrollable urge to kill. According to interviews from his trial, the voices in Victor's head were loud and clear, telling him, "This is it. This is where you have to go and do it." Now, to his surprise, he allegedly recognized the kitchen, despite never having been there before or even knowing the Petersons. It felt so familiar, like he'd seen it in a dream before. Not long after entering, he was confronted by James Peterson, who, not knowing who Victor was or why he was there, lunged toward him, trying to protect his family. James fought back, but Victor was too fast. He shot James 7 times as he tried to shield his loved ones. Afterward, Victor went back outside to reload his gun and gather his thoughts. But as he stood there, he saw Evelyn, James's wife, climbing out of a window with their youngest son, Larry, in her arms. Without hesitation, he shot Evelyn and left her where she fell, motionless. Victor didn't stop there. He went back inside the house, where the Peterson children were still asleep in their beds. One by one, he shot and killed 6 of them: Jean, Mary, Dorothy, Pearl, William, and Colin. at close range while they lay defenseless. The children had no chance. He then returned to where Evelyn's lifeless body lay and took Larry's life as well. He later claimed it was a mercy killing, reasoning that the young boy was too little to survive alone. Victor's twisted reasoning didn't stop there. Since he'd already killed James, he felt there was no reason to leave anyone alive to identify him. So, he set about collecting as many spent cartridge cases as he could find, making sure there was nothing left behind that could tie him to the scene. After the horrific act, Victor made his way back to his own parents' house. He arrived around 7:30 in the morning, but instead of feeling any sense of relief, he was overcome with sickness and horror at what he had just done. The guilt weighed on him heavily as he spent the rest of the day wrestling with the reality of his actions. Meanwhile, Will Drew Lang arrived at the Peterson farm, expecting to see James, but James was nowhere to be found. It was getting close to 9 a.m., so Lang, assuming James had slept in, joked to the house, calling out for him. But when he pushed open the door, his casual tone quickly turned into one of shock. Inside, he found James Peterson's lifeless body sprawled on the kitchen floor. Horrified, Lang quickly backed away and rushed to his car. He drove to the nearest phone, a good 4 miles down the road, to make the call that would change everything. The peaceful morning in Shell Lake was shattered, and the Peterson family's lives, along with everyone in the surrounding area, would never be the same. When the police arrived at the Peterson farmhouse, they wasted no time. They rushed in, scanning the home for any survivors and clues that could help them understand what had happened. But the scene they found was chilling. There were no signs of a robbery, and everything appeared untouched. It seemed like there was no clear motive for the murders. Inside, they found 28 bullets, with 27 of them having hit their targets. It was clear that the killings were deliberate, not random. Boot prints were also discovered on the kitchen's linoleum floor, but oddly, no boots from the Peterson home matched the prints. Alongside that, 5 cartridge casings were found, confirming that a .22 caliber weapon had been used. Then, just as they were starting their investigation, something eerie happened. A muffled noise broke the silence. They traced the sound to one of the beds, where, hidden under the sheets and wedged between the bodies of her sisters, they found 4-year-old Phyllis. She was the only survivor of the horrifying massacre. At first, she didn't fully understand what had happened, but she could sense the severity of the situation. Later, she recalled how the officer who carried her from the house was crying. That was when she knew something truly terrible had taken place. Phyllis's survival was a miracle, and her story would haunt everyone who heard it. The massacre of the Peterson family became one of the most gruesome crime scenes many officers had ever witnessed. Phyllis was taken to her uncle's house nearby, while Kathy, her older sister, was notified of the tragedy. Devastated, Kathy moved back to Shell Lake to care for her surviving sister. As the police investigated, they combed through the tall grass and fields surrounding the farm, hoping to find something, anything, that might give them a lead. Roadblocks were set up, and the search for the killer expanded across the area, growing larger with each passing day. They spent days searching, with dogs and a search party of 250 people scouring the land, but nothing turned up. Then on the 4th day, they caught a break. A local resident from Liask, concerned about the tragedy, walked into the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Detachment office in Shellbrook. The resident suggested they look into a young man, the son of his neighbor, who had recently been discharged from a mental hospital. The man had a known obsession with guns and hunting, which immediately raised red flags. The corporal and his team didn't hesitate. They quickly got in their cars and drove down the narrow, winding highways toward Lesk, their destination, the farm owned by the Hoffman family. They had a hunch this might be the lead they were desperately looking for. They started by questioning Victor's parents, focusing specifically on any firearms, boots, and of course, their son. As the investigation went on, things started to add up. A rifle was found on the Hoffman's property, and although it wasn't the exact model they originally expected, it was still significant. The police had it sent for ballistics testing to see if it matched the bullets from the Peterson home. During the search, the detectives also spotted a pair of rubber boots. These boots were sent for comparison too, and when the results came back, it was clear. Both the rifle and the boots matched evidence found at the Peterson house. It wasn't long before they had enough evidence to make an arrest. Victor Hoffman was charged with the brutal murders of 9 members of the Peterson family. When the arrest was made, there was something chilling about Victor's demeanor. Described by police as a single average build man, he didn't seem afraid at all. In fact, he was eerily calm and surrendered without any resistance. His arrest happened just 3 hours after the funeral for the Petersons, adding a whole new layer of shock and horror to the case. Victor was taken to the station in North Battleford, and for the first 10 to 15 minutes, he was silent, not saying a word. But eventually, he broke down. What came next was even more disturbing. Victor confessed to everything. He admitted that the devil made him kill the Petersons. But perhaps the most unsettling part of his confession came when he was asked about Phyllis, the only survivor. Victor claimed that he spared Phyllis because she had the face of an angel. As for the others, he said he didn't respect them because they looked like pigs. These chilling responses raised serious concerns about Victor's mental state. So instead of being sent to a regular prison, he was taken to a nearby mental hospital for further evaluation. There, doctors diagnosed him once again with paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that had clearly gone untreated. Despite this, the court found that he was still fit to stand trial. Victor's trial began on January 8, 1968, and his charges were 2 counts of non-capital murder. The defense team argued that Victor wouldn't have committed the horrific crime if it hadn't been for his untreated mental illness. They stood firm, insisting that his condition played a central role in the tragedy. After deliberating for 3.5 hours, the jury reached a verdict. Despite the overwhelming evidence against Victor, the jury found him not guilty by reason of insanity. The decision stunned many and left people questioning how someone who had confessed to such a brutal crime could escape the full weight of justice. But the jury's decision was based on something that many hadn't expected at the time: Victor's mental health. The doctor who had testified for the defense had given such a detailed and logical explanation of Victor's mental illness that the jury felt convinced. They understood that Victor was driven by something that, in his mind, felt real. His paranoia and delusions had played a major role in what happened, and that convinced the jury that he truly believed he was doing what he thought was necessary. Although Victor wouldn't spend the rest of his life in prison, the judge made sure he didn't get off easy. Instead of a typical prison sentence, Victor was committed to an institution for the criminally insane. This seemed to hurt him even more. After hearing the verdict, he just sat there, looking straight ahead, showing absolutely no emotion. It was as if the reality of his situation hadn't hit him yet. Victor was sent to a facility in southern Ontario where he would stay indefinitely, with his release depending on government regulations. For years, he remained in that institution, out of the public eye, until December of 2001, when he was granted supervised access to nearby towns. But even this small amount of freedom didn't last long. Victor would never experience true freedom again. On May 21, 2004, Victor died in custody from cancer, but the aftermath of his crimes would linger for much longer. Kathy, the sister of one of the victims, took on the responsibility of raising Phyllis, the only survivor of the massacre. She raised Phyllis alongside her own children, giving her a second chance at life after the horrors she had experienced. Eventually, Kathy and her husband retired from farming and moved to a nearby town after their family farmhouse burned down. But despite the years that had passed, both Kathy and Phyllis couldn't shake their frustrations about what happened. Phyllis had been a little girl when the massacre occurred, and as she grew up, she still struggled with the shadow of the tragedy. She spoke about how difficult it was to live with the unwanted attention that came with being the only survivor. People looked at her differently, and it was hard to escape the weight of the past. In an interview in 2004, Phyllis opened up about her struggles. She said, "It was always hard to adjust, always feeling like I didn't fit in, until I had my son, James." Having James was a turning point for Phyllis. It helped her heal in ways she never thought possible. Sadly, Phyllis passed away from cancer in May of 2019. A Canadian journalist named Peter Tadman wrote a book titled The Shell Lake Massacre, where he covered the details of the case. In the book, Peter interviewed Victor several times, and he reported that Victor stood firm in his belief that he didn't feel any guilt for his actions. He even claimed that he still saw the devil who had compelled him to murder so many innocent people. To this day, the Peterson Massacre remains one of Canada's most horrific random killings, second only to the Portapique Massacre in 2020, where 22 innocent lives were taken. While the insanity ruling in Victor's case is something we can't ignore, it's definitely a tough one to digest. Just because someone is deemed insane doesn't mean their actions can be justified. No innocent life should ever be lost, no matter the circumstances. But let's be real. None of this would have happened if Victor hadn't been released from the mental hospital in the first place. So, what do you think? Was Victor truly a psychopath who somehow got loose, or do you think there's something else going on here? I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and let's talk about it. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.